That being said, today's webinar will be about half an hour of information sharing from my end out into the audience, after which we'll have at least 15 minutes of Q&A. During the presentation, do feel free to put your questions already in the chat, so don't feel obliged to wait until after half an hour. If you have a question during the presentation, just put it in the chat. I'll try to look at the chat every now and then and see if I can answer questions on the go. If not, then in the Q&A, I'll try to come back at questions and or reflections. And if we don't, or if we're not able to answer all the questions and or reflections in the Q&A today, then we try to address them in a summary. Both the recording, the slides, and also the summary will be shared with you. So in case you feel that there's a lot of data, and trust me, there will be a lot of data, if it goes a bit too fast, you will have the opportunity to revisit all of this at your own pace after today's webinar. That being said, let's get started. Short introduction on my end. My name is Egbert Schram. I'm the Group CEO at The Culture Factor, legally registered as Hofstede Insights OY, so Finnish, Finland-based company, Finnish ownership, although most of our employees are not Finnish, including myself being Dutch. If you want to know more about my background, there is a QR code, so you can just connect with me over LinkedIn. In a nutshell, I've been working in the area of culture for the better part of the last 2 decades. And as CEO at The Culture Factor, what we do on a day-to-day basis is make the impact of culture tangible, basically unlocking cultural data so that organizations and individuals alike can get much more hands-on with a topic that's a bit like a box of Pringles, meaning once you pop, you can't stop. Culture is a fascinating topic, and we'll come back into what are the consequences of it being so fascinating. In a nutshell, as an organization for the last roughly 40 years, we've worked with organizations like the ones you see with the logos in front of you, because culture is a topic that touches every single company, whether you want it or not, because culture is what happens when people meet. And in work life, this typically is therefore connected to the organization you work in. And that's something that we'll come back at through today. Culture is a matter of perspective. There are different angles to culture, different opinions as well. There's a lot of opinions when it comes to culture because it's a topic that brings a lot of emotions forward. But relatively few organizations and people have the width and depth of the data that we as an organization have collected over the better part of the last 40 years, and the width and depth of the data that we collect on an annual basis. Every year, we assess roughly 16 to 25,000 people. Every year, we assess over 200 organizations and how their corporate culture, organizational culture, is shaping. So when we talk about the topic, what is culture? It is useful to make sure that we all have a similar definition. And a way to go about that is to ask a simple question in the chat. Can you answer the question, what is it that you see in the picture in front of you? So if in the chat you just type, what is it that you see? Let's see, what are the different reflections on this picture? So I'll give it a minute, like 30 seconds or so, to see what kind of opinions come out. Some of you that have known me for longer, you know that I use this picture a lot. But let's see what are some of the very quick impressions. I can see some very deep answers, very philosophical. But I can see very quickly quite a bit of similarity in the answers. And that is that a lot of us tend to, at least initially, see a frog or a toad. Now, for those of you that are not able to see what some of you see, which is a horse, I'm going to ask you to tilt your head to your right shoulder and look up down. Because what are the eyes of the frog could also be interpreted as the nose or nostrils of a horse. The hind legs of the frog could also be interpreted as the ears of the horse. And the flowy stuff in the blue background could be seen as the hair or the manes of the horse. Long story short, this is one way in which to reflect upon culture, which is we see things, but we interpret it in different ways depending on the angle that we take. And that's kind of like the important thing to take along when we dive into all the data that I'm going to unleash upon you in today's webinar. What is it that we see and how do we interpret it? Depends on the angle that we take. And that brings us to the definition we use when we talk about the topic of culture, which is two angles. On a national level, culture informs us how are people in a particular country coded or programmed compared to people that have been raised in another country and maybe even still live in another country. So national culture is comparing one country to the next and how our upbringing, our education has impacted certain perceptions. And I'll talk a little bit more about that shortly from the Finnish perspective. When we bring the topic of culture into organizations, what we get is a much clearer definition. Organizational culture, the way we define it, is how people relate to each other, meaning their colleagues, their subordinates, their bosses, how they relate to the work they do, meaning what is more important if you think about your day-to-day job? Is it what you do or how you do it? And last but not least, how do we relate to people outside our organization? How do we relate to our customers, to the public? All of this shapes our attitude towards work, either in a positive way or in a less than positive way. And we'll also dive into this moving forward. What is the relevance of this from an organizational perspective is summarized with the following slide. If you fail to really dive into the topic of culture from a corporate and or organizational side, you will face unnecessary delays. Cross-cultural teams in particular tend to take 4 to 5 months to norm and storm to shape a common way of working. If you take culture into account, you can halve this time. So you can save yourself 2-3 months of unnecessary frustration. Not working in a way that makes sense also contributes to an increase of stress, an increase of sick leave, and a lack of motivation. From a marketing point of view, it leads to failed product launches. So culture has significant costs attached to it if you don't take it into account. On the upside, get the culture element right, and you will be able to realize return on investments of up to 400%. And this is not just talking about an awareness workshop here and there. It's really making sure that culture is at the core of how you operate the organization in which you work. So when we talk about work and we talk about the ways in which we work, there are different perspectives to how companies tend to talk about culture. Most companies, and especially most executive teams and HR folks, talk about culture from the way they would like it to be. So it's a desire, it's an emotional preference. Some people that are a bit more strategically skilled tend to talk about culture from the perspective of this is the way we need to be in order to be successful, taking into account restrictions, legal restrictions, workforce restrictions, economical restrictions. It's easy to want to be something, but if reality hits, how likely are you to actually succeed in being that? So staying real is very important when deciding on the type of culture you can build. Then there is a perception. We all have perceptions. The unfortunate reality is that executive teams tend to live in the proverbial ivory tower. They tend to know very little about the actual culture on the ground. And that's where the actual culture analytics come in. Understanding how do people actually relate to each other, their work, and the outside world? And how does that impact our ability to execute our strategy? Now, coming back to the topic of today, Finland. When going through the results, it's important to realize what is Finnish national culture all about, because this national culture contributes to the preferences, the emotional preferences that people have when it comes to what they expect from work life. Finland as a country is not a very hierarchical country. That means in practice that people don't really like the idea of being told top down. People expect to be given the leniency and the space to figure things out for themselves. Finland is also a relatively task-oriented culture. So people prefer to get clarity on what is expected, but not with a lot of detail on how to go about executing it. That's what people try to prefer to do by themselves. It also means there's a very clear-cut split between work life and private life. And that does inform that people would like to rather get the job done faster and then go home and be with their family. That is also involved by the fact that Finnish society is not defined by the work that people do. Unlike other cultures that score much more assertive, and that's that MAS, achievement orientation, Finland and the other Nordics for that matter, tend to prefer private time, leisure time, free time, over being able to say, I'm a really successful business person or I'm a top professional. As said, work does not define who people are in Finland. People do like a sense of predictability. So clarity on what is the framework in which I'm expected to operate? And why am I expected to operate? That's that fifth dilemma of time orientation. A higher score on LTO means that people need to understand the why question. The how, less important, as long as the box, the frame is clear. And then last but not least, there has to be a certain amount of fun at work. Not too much, but a certain amount. It doesn't always need to be very pessimistic or sober. It just needs to be clear so that people can decide when is the time for partying and when is the time for work. This is in a nutshell, very short nutshell, Finnish national culture, which shapes the context of the results I'm now going to share with you. What we have done is we've looked at roughly 3 years of standardized data amongst over 211 organizational assessments spread across 166 countries on the organizational culture analytics. So how do people relate to work? We have then zoomed in on the data specifically related to Finland, and that is data collected from about 3,000 respondents, roughly equal distribution across two major gender identities, depending on your definition, and equally spread out across the major age cohorts, meaning millennial and Gen Z below 39, Gen X 40 to 49, or let's say a little bit above that even, and then the boomer generation. So roughly representative of the wider Finnish society. When we assess organizational culture, we look at 6 organizational dilemmas, call it problem statements. Every organization, it doesn't matter whether you are Amazon or Nike or IKEA or the Finnish government or Helsinki city, doesn't matter. Every organization, profit, non-profit, local, international, deals with the same 6 basic questions. The first question is, what is more important, the goal or the process? When we look at Finland, and again, the global report you can find also on our website, but if we zoom in on Finland, today's topic, what we can see is that employees wish to be much more goal-oriented than their managers allow them to be. Furthermore, globally, women tend to be much more goal-oriented than men. So two interesting observations. Number one, employees want to be more focused on the goal compared to what their managers allow them to be, and this creates tension. And women tend to be more goal-oriented than men, both internationally and also in Finland. If we dive into the gender split, and again, I'll stay at the what could be considered the main genders, male, female, we see very little big differences other than what I just mentioned. Women are more goal-oriented. You also see in that orange row people's wish. So all ages wish to be rather goal-oriented compared to what we call D1 actual, which is on a scale of 0 to 100 around that 55 mark. Managers who focus much more on the process. And this leads to tension from the perspective of that when managers force people to follow the process but are not able to explain the why, and this is why we go back to the Finnish national culture where the why is important, it leads to tension. Because people want to know why. Why am I supposed to follow a process? So the lesson here for managers is to be very clear on why is the process more important than the goal? Because sometimes there are very good reasons for this. But if people don't talk about these reasons, it creates tension, which is unnecessary. So what are good reasons to be more process-oriented? Safety, regulations, legislation. Three very typical examples. If the reasons are not connected to these, and they're just because the process must be followed type of answers, again, it creates unnecessary tension. And we'll come back at that in today's summary, because there are consequences to this. Then we dive into a second dilemma. Is the customer always right? If we look at this globally, we can see that in some countries, employees indicate, well, actually, yes, the customer is always right. So we will work extra hours, we will do overtime to please the customer. But Finland is not one of those countries. In Finland, employees wish to be less customer-oriented than their managers. And this makes you wonder, could it be that the goals that managers get are unnecessarily focused on pleasing the customer? And you might already start to get a feeling that, okay, so if the process is more important than the goal and the customer is more important than the process, yes, you will be as confused as Finnish employees are. If there is unclarity on this balance between process or customer, it creates confusion. And it creates a lack of clear priorities, meaning when am I supposed to follow the process versus when am I supposed to ignore the process and please the customer? And this is where management has to up their game. There are no major differences in Finland compared to global results, but Finland, you could say, because the typical Finnish question is, how does Sweden score? Finland scores worse than Sweden, meaning the gap is bigger than in Sweden. So maybe something worthwhile to improve. If we look at the deeper data, here we can see that this is the gap. So a score of 42 means that people wish to be more process-oriented compared to what people experience in real life. When I come back in the summary, I will not highlight this dimension because, as you can see, the gap is less than 10 points, meaning it is something to pay attention to, but there are more pressing matters. So stay tuned. If you get the question, what is better? A brand new solution, something completely innovative, or a flawlessly executed process? What would be your answer? You can already see in the circle some difference here between the Nordics. And this is also one reason why there are different success rates when it comes to launching products and services. Sweden is actually something of an oddity compared to Finland. In Finland, people actually prefer to be less focused on the process. And this connects to that first dilemma. So employees wish to have clarity on the goal. They wish to be able to follow that what has been expressed, not that what the customer demands. And they wish to be left alone in their priority setting. So the mental image that is being created is that Finnish employees wish to have clarity and the freedom to decide their own working process and not be left up to the whims of a manager and or a customer to change priorities on the go, because this creates confusion. And in the Finnish national culture, one of the prime, call it differentiators compared to other Nordics, is that Finnish workforce in general wishes predictability. Predictability to develop, predictability to decide their own work life. And the current experience is that this is lacking. So it creates a lot of uncertainty, a lot of confusion, and a lot of stress. Contrary to the global results, globally, men tend to wish a more strict work environment because strictness also means it's more simple, perhaps, meaning you don't need to talk so much. In Finland, this is actually opposite. Finnish men would like to have a more easygoing culture compared to Finnish women. So this is something interesting to zoom in on. Again, from an overall strategic reflection, the gap between what people wish and what people see or experience is relatively small. So this dimension is not of a very big strategic importance, nonetheless interesting to take along from a management control point of view. And now we're starting to get into the coming three dimensions, dilemmas, challenges, where Finnish scores are, or the differences between reality and emotional preferences are very big. The first one is connected to what we would call learning culture. What is more important if you think about your career development? Is it loyalty to be the best professional? Is it loyalty towards your employer? Is it loyalty to your team? Or is it loyalty to your direct boss? Finland separates itself from the other Nordics with a very strong wish from employees to focus on their personal career development. Not so much on loyalty towards their employer, their team, or their direct manager. Globally, Gen X, boomers, so the older part of the workforce, wishes more focus on this professional development, whereas perhaps contrary to what you might have thought, Gen Z and millennials wish to have more hands-on guidance. Perhaps because life is more uncertain, hands-on guidance, being told what to do, when to do it, how to do it, takes some difficulties away, less choices to make, so mentally perhaps easier. What I wanted to highlight here is in the orange row. As said, in Finland, this career focus, being the top possible expert or profession, is something that people prefer to get the chance to do. It's not what they get. And this perhaps has something to do with the lack of professional management standards in the overall Finnish workforce, whereby it tends to be experts that get promoted. And then you create a work environment whereby indicating disagreement can be seen as challenging people's expertise, which is in most cases not very favorably received. So a very big challenge, and I would say the Finnish work-life environment, is the misconception or the misalignment on managerial expectations and skill development. And it's a large gap from international standards. It is also connected to this fifth dilemma, which is how long should it actually take to feel at home? How approachable should people be? Globally, people in general wish to have a more open culture, meaning information exchange is easier, you feel at home faster, work is a bit like a family type of environment, so you shouldn't be too much on your guard. Globally, Finnish workforce, because they experience a very closed workforce, very closed work environment, they want to have a much more open work environment. Unlike global results, what you can see in Finland is that people above the age of 50 want to have a more open culture. And in Finland, this is the other way around. The older people get, the less openness they require, perhaps because work life is already getting to an end. Younger people want to have a lot more openness. And again, women want to have more openness than men. If we zoom in on the Finnish results, what we can see is almost a 33-point gap between what people experience, meaning a work life that is relatively closed emotionally, to what people prefer. And the way to reflect on this, if you are in HR, is that this has a lot to do with, do people actually prefer to stay at work? Do people get a sense of being recognized for who they are as opposed to what they do? Do people feel included in decision making? And again, from a national cultural point of view, this inclusion in decision making is considered a very favorable employer provision. It's what people expect, but in Finland, it's not what people get. That gets us to almost the end of the information. Do you work to live or live to work? In Finland, because, as I already mentioned, private life and leisure time are considered more important in defining who you are, as opposed to other cultures where work defines who you are, what we can see is that people wish for a lot more employee orientation. What we did when we looked into these results is that we compared the Finnish labor utilization rate. In other words, how big a percentage of the workforce is actually active in work life. And perhaps because of these results, Finland scores worse than the OECD, the developed industrial nations, because of these results. People are forced to follow processes without being told why, and they are being put under a lot of pressure to develop and basically achieve their results. This combination, follow the process without understanding why, whereas people experience and wish to be told why and then to be given the freedom to execute it the way they see fit, leads to an above average rate of burnout. So in a nutshell, whenever there is a gap of 20 points or more between the actual culture and the desired culture, both of which we measure, it creates tension. This tension has economical consequences. Lack of motivation, unnecessary delays, lack of success, burnout rates increase. In other words, significant financial costs, let alone the social costs. So, in a nutshell, Finnish work life is experienced as way too process-oriented. Work life is focused on hierarchical loyalty as opposed to individual career development. Work life is experienced as not transparent enough. People feel a lack of emotional connection. And last but not least, work life is experienced as too pressured, too much pressure on output, too little on the individual. And if you take these results, and I said you compare this with the OECD stats on how much percentage of workforce is productively contributing to an economy, Finland is underperforming, whereas it doesn't need to. Now, if you want to help your organization or your customers' organizations to do better in these fields, there's a couple of things to keep in mind. Number one, it starts at the top. Forget about culture initiatives that are grassroots. If the top does not walk the talk, it won't work. Culture is led top down. That is the mirror that people will look up to. You have to provide hands-on guidance. In other words, be very clear on the priorities that people need to follow. Otherwise, people will overwork themselves, and that creates burnout. And last but not least, please have discussions with the people inside your organization on how does the strategy of the organization translate to a department's strategy, to a team's strategy, to the individual. Statistics show that 93% of people are not able to iterate the strategy of their company. This is not their fault. This is the fault of leadership and HR in not making sure that everybody is capable of understanding what does the corporate strategy mean for me on a day-to-day basis. So this is where the opportunity lies. And if you want to know more about how to do this in practice, we have an upcoming sessions roughly every second month, which we call going beyond cultural awareness. Next one is April 11th, 3 hours towards the end of the workday. After that, it would be June. And the main output you get from those awareness sessions is how do you engage in that discussion of making sure that the work we do makes strategic sense and at the same time remains emotionally sustainable. On that note, I'm about to stop sharing my screen and open the floor for questions and comments. As said, if you want to stay in touch, also feel free to link up through LinkedIn or just send us an email through either my personal email address or info@theculturefactor.com. That is the end of my slides, and that means I've got all of you in front of you and look forward to hearing about your questions. And as said, we will be sharing both the recording, the slides to all of the people that have registered. The global report you can find on our website. So I'll be quiet for a moment to see if questions come in. And in case you have a question, feel free to either use the chat or alternatively, if you raise your digital hand, we should be able to see it and enable you to unmute so that you can verbally ask the question. So I have a private question here. Is there something that you have observed in Finland that would be a good practice in terms of communicating a strategy down into the rest of the organization? Well, if you take the Finnish national culture, which is built around, as mentioned, understanding the why and understanding the, call it, framework of engagement or the rules of engagement, plus being included in the discussion. My tip is take your corporate strategy into your team and ask your team 5 questions. I will only give you the first 2. Again, this is part of our sales strategy. If you want to know the other 3, you have to reach out. But the first and most important question, ask your team, what is it that you get paid for to deliver? So you have your strategy, ask the question, what is it that you get paid for to deliver? Now, some people will say, yeah, it's a product. Other people will say, it's a service. Yet others would say, yeah, it's an experience. The point is, from a management consulting point of view, so for me as an outsider, I really don't care. And that's very bluntly stated by my side, but it is your organization's goal to care about its own strategy. What matters is that people are unanimous in their reflection on what is it that they get paid for. Is it a product? Is it a service? Is it an experience that you wish to give to your customers? Because if the answer is not the same, you look at a strategy from a different perspective. If I'm paid to deliver an experience, I'm going to measure, and that's the second question, how do you measure basically the quality of what you deliver? I'm going to measure it in different ways than when I'm paid to deliver a product. So it could be user experience versus zero error. And they don't need to be excluding each other. The point again is the answer to that first question, what is it that you get paid to do, has to be a unanimous inside a team. Otherwise, things are going to go split direction. You create frustration without really ever understanding why is it that we're frustrated? Well, because one of you is thinking about a product, the other is thinking about an experience, and you measure these things in different ways. So I hope that that gave a initial reflection. Then what happens if the top of the organization is not or does not want to be part of the change? Has this happened in your company? So has this happened in, I guess, customer cases that I have seen? Let's put it this way. And again, I personally am rather bullish in this. So take that as a disclaimer. If as a management team, you agree on a strategy and you agree on those 5 questions, 2 of which I've given you, what is it that you get paid to do? And number 2, how do you measure the quality of it? And you have given executives the chance to walk the talk. If an executive then continues to defy what has been agreed, there's the door, would be my very blunt management consulting advice. Executives in my book have only one job, walk the talk. And the way they do this is to show it by their behavior. If they, despite being given the chance, do not walk the talk, then they have to go, because the consequences of leadership not walking the talk cannot be underestimated, unfortunately. Then a question there from Alexandra. How can people not at the top influence an organization's culture? I would say by requesting the clarity on those questions. So if you get taught by the top or by HR that there is a culture and the values of a company are, we can take an example. A very typical value statement is we have an open culture. Be critical. Why do we need to have an open culture? How do we deal with data privacy and data protection if we need to have an open culture? So, and again, this is culturally biased coming from a person from a less hierarchical culture, working in not so hierarchical a culture. This is not as easy for people that come from environments or cultures where you are taught not to disobey the top. Yet at the same time, and again, I am biased in that perception, if you are a professional, in my book, I would advise you be critical. So when HR or corporate communications is telling you to have be open, and you see behavior that isn't open, or you see behavior that is too open, what is an open culture? So ask critical questions that force the top and HR alike to be very explicit, and that's why we use a scale of 0 to 100 with behaviors attached to it. Be explicit in how are you supposed to walk the talk, and pinpoint when people are not walking the talk. And you can do this respectfully, that, hey, One of our values is we want to have an open culture, yet at the same time, I feel that in your behavior, you're not sharing all of the information. This is one way of then addressing cultural marketing terms. So I hope, Alexandra, that answered your question, or at least gave a perspective on it. Then a question from Laurent. I've seen many organizations starting their cultural understanding after it exploded as a conflict. Yes, this is unfortunately something that we as consulting organization tend to experience. We tend to be called in when things have blown up. Um, Luckily, in most cases, not literally blown up, but at least emotionally, there's been a lot of tension and a lot of stress. And this is why I mentioned that this is not necessary, but it does require a willingness to accept that culture is complicated. It takes people 4 to 5 years to get a master's in psychology, and culture is way more complicated than psychology because we're looking at how groups of people interact. That means that if a VP of people and culture has not gone through basic cultural training, it is very unlikely that they understand the intricacies of how culture needs to be balanced in service of the strategy of the company and the national cultures in which a corporation or an organization operates. So it can be avoided, but the reality is that in most cases also we get called in when things have unfortunately exploded, and that means that you need to first neutralize all of the negative emotions. And that is done typically by understanding where do these negative emotions come from, understanding that it's culture. It's nothing to do with an individual personality. Um, and that in itself is actually a great relief for many people that, hey, yes, I am a unique individual, yet at the same time, I'm also a product of the national culture in which I grew up. And that has shaped certain expectations towards what I want from work life. And if you understand yourself and the organizational management understands where they themselves come from, there are ways to find a common way. How can you know if executives don't walk the talk? Couple of ways. Number one, sick leave. So if sick leave is above industry or call it sector average, it typically means there is a mismatch in culture. There is a values gap, a values clash between what people experience and what people want. This is one. And you will have those figures if you're reasonably sized organizations. You actually have to keep track of sick leave figures. And in Finland, Statistics Finland and DHL will have, Työterveyslaitos will have information on what is considered normal or average in a particular industry. So this is one, factual statistics. The others is that you have a lot of retention. So if and again, every sector will have retention rates that are considered average or therefore perhaps normal. If your retention figures are bigger than industry average, typically this is a cultural clash. And if they can be attributed to a particular business unit, then in most cases you have to look into the way in which a unit works. Typically, there is a cultural clash between organizational practices and emotional preferences. So these are two different ways using statistics to understand, do we have a walk the talk problem? Those were quite a few questions. So I hope the answers have given a reflection on the questions. That being said, it is now a 2:45. That means that we are officially at the end of the scheduled time. But in case you haven't noticed, culture is a fascinating topic. So let's give it one more question. In case there is a question that has popped up, then we can still take that into reflection. If not, then we shall stop the recording and work on the summary of today's webinar. And with that, as said, we aim to come back tomorrow with a reflection. In case you want to know more about how to deal with this inside your organizational environment in more practical terms, keep in mind that introduction awareness session on April 11th. And if you can't make that in June, hope to stay in touch, and wishing you a very nice continuation of a relatively sunny Tuesday afternoon here in Helsinki. Cheers and goodbye. Bye-bye.